Imagine discovering the unthinkable that your child, the one you raised with love and care, harbored a deadly secret. This is the haunting story of Brian Cohey, a quiet young man with a fascination for crime scene investigation, who hid a dark truth behind closed doors. It was an ordinary day in the town of Grand Junction, Colorado, when Brian's mother, Terry, stumbled upon something in his closet, a horrifying discovery that would forever change their family's life. There, she found the severed head and hands of Warren Barnes, a local man who had gone missing. What led Brian, an aspiring investigator himself, down such a twisted path? And how does a family, a community, cope with the knowledge that one of their own could commit such a brutal act? This is the story of a family's sudden descent into a nightmare, and the chilling reality that sometimes darkness is closer to home than we could ever imagine. Brian Cohey. I grew up in the quiet town of Grand Junction, nestled in Colorado's western slope. To anyone on the outside, the Cohey family appeared as ordinary as any in their suburban neighborhood. Brian was raised by his mother, Terry, and his father, Brian Sr., in a household that valued education and held close ties to the community. Brian was a typical young boy in many ways, quiet and introspective, with a noticeable curiosity for books and science. But as he grew older, that curiosity started to shift. Brian developed an intense interest in crime scene investigations, far beyond what most teenagers might consider normal. He would spend hours reading about forensic science, examining crime scene photos, and watching documentaries that delved into the darker side of humanity. At first, his family and friends saw it as an academic interest. After all, Brian dreamed of a career in law enforcement. Yet there were moments that seemed, in hindsight, unsettling. He would casually discuss topics like serial killers and violent crime with an almost detached fascination, finding fascination where others saw horror. He had an uncanny ability to recall intricate details of famous criminal cases, down to the most disturbing elements. Teachers noted his detailed knowledge of forensics, while classmates sometimes described him as different, as disinterested, even cold. To his parents, though, Brian was simply their son. A bit eccentric perhaps, but ambitious and intelligent. They believed his fixation on crime was simply a phase, a stepping stone toward his future goals. Little did they know, this passion would eventually blur the lines between curiosity and cruelty, pushing their family down a path they could never have anticipated. It was an unremarkable day, an afternoon like any other in the Cohey household. Terry was at home, going about her usual chores, unaware that she was about to stumble upon a discovery that would forever shatter her world. Brian's room had always been a private space, his sanctuary of books and journals stacked in careful order, so his parents rarely ventured inside. But on this day, something nudged her to enter, a mother's intuition, perhaps, or simply a passing curiosity. She noticed a faint, strange odor in the air, something metallic and sharp that made her stomach tighten. As she moved closer to the closet, her hands felt cold, her heartbeat drumming louder in her ears. She could feel the tension building, an inexplicable dread rising within her. When she opened the closet door, her breath caught in her throat. There, hidden beneath layers of clothes, was something wrapped in a plastic bag. She reached out, hands trembling, pulling at the edges of the bag, and suddenly the horrific reality stared back at her. She was looking at the severed head and hands of a man she didn't recognize, a man who had once been alive, breathing, walking the same streets as her family. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled back, her mind racing, trying to process what she was seeing. This was beyond anything she could have ever imagined. She was frozen in that moment, caught between denial and the dawning horror that this wasn't a mistake, that this wasn't some terrifying prank. Slowly, she pieced together the unthinkable. Her son, her own flesh and blood, was somehow involved in this atrocity. Terry's next move was instinctive. She reached for her phone and dialed 911, her hands barely able to press the buttons as her mind raced. The authorities arrived swiftly, their flashing lights casting a harsh glow on the quiet street as neighbors peered from their windows, wondering what calamity had struck the Cohey home. As officers entered the room and took in the scene, the quiet suburban home transformed into a crime scene, a place of secrets exposed under the cold, unforgiving light. Detectives began their questioning, but Terry struggled to form words, still numb from the shock. How could this have happened? How could her son, the boy she raised, be capable of such violence? And yet, the evidence was undeniable. Officers began examining the room, meticulously documenting every piece of evidence, trying to understand the mind that had carefully hidden such darkness in the safety of a family home. In the following days, Terry and her husband were forced to confront the unimaginable reality that their son was at the center of a grisly investigation. The quiet, introspective boy they had known now seemed like a stranger, someone unrecognizable. They replayed memories in their minds, looking for any signs, any warnings they may have missed. The weight of guilt and disbelief hung heavily over them, casting long shadows on the very foundation of their family. Neighbors watched in silent judgment as detectives came and went, taking Brian into custody, leaving the Cohee family under a cloud of suspicion and shame. How had they not seen the signs? Could they have done something to prevent this? These were questions that would haunt them for years to come, unanswered as they grappled with the shattering truth of who their son had become. The investigation into Brian Cohee's crimes would soon reveal a darkness far deeper than anyone could have imagined. As detectives delved into the case, they began piecing together a trail of chilling evidence that painted a disturbing picture of a young man consumed by a violent fascination. It started with the grim discovery in his bedroom closet Warren Barnes's severed head and hands, a ghastly revelation that sent the Grand Junction Police Department into a state of urgency. Detectives combed through Brian's room with meticulous care, uncovering details that hinted at a calculated plan. Among his belongings, they found journals filled with descriptions of crime scenes, meticulous notes about dismemberment, and drawings that hinted at an obsession with death and disfigurement. But these were not just the idle musings of an enthusiast. They read like a blueprint, a dark manual leading him deeper into the realms of his morbid curiosity. Forensic teams moved in, analyzing every inch of evidence they could gather. Blood traces in the closet matched that of Warren Barnes, confirming that the victim's final moments had somehow intersected with Brian's twisted intentions. Further investigation led officers to a secluded area outside of town, where they found additional remains and personal belongings of Barnes. Brian had attempted to discard certain evidence far from home, but a few overlooked details would betray him. Detectives then turned their attention to Brian's online activity, where they uncovered a haunting digital footprint. His internet search history revealed countless hours spent researching dismemberment techniques, decomposition processes, and notorious killers throughout history. His online presence reflected a fascination that had grown beyond mere interest, veering dangerously into obsession. It was here, behind the anonymity of a screen, that Brian had started honing his methods, using real-life cases as studies, fueling the dark urge that had taken hold of him. Police interviews with Brian's acquaintances unearthed additional, troubling insights. Classmates recalled Brian speaking casually, almost indifferently, about violent crimes. He would sometimes bring up graphic details about infamous serial killers, leaving others uneasy, though most dismissed it as a harmless quirk. But these anecdotes began to add weight to the theory that Brian had been nurturing a fascination for far longer than anyone suspected. Detectives learned of his academic interests in forensic science, his intense focus on criminal cases, and his unemotional discussions around death and violence. But what was most unsettling were the signs that Brian may have been preparing for something beyond the single crime he had already committed. Among his belongings, investigators found sketches and notes indicating potential future victims, lists of supplies, and possible disposal sites. It appeared that Warren Barnes might not have been an isolated act, but the first step in a much darker path Brian had planned. In a later statement, one of the lead detectives admitted that this case was unlike any they had ever encountered. It wasn't just the act itself, he said. It was the cold, clinical way he documented everything, like he was studying the process, perfecting it. That's what set him apart from others. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a calculated project. As the pieces fell into place, Brian Cohee's portrayal transformed from a troubled young man into something more chilling. He had studied, prepared, and executed his plan with a calculated detachment that disturbed even the most seasoned investigators. His fascination with crime had morphed into an unquenchable desire to experience the act himself, making him both the observer and the participant in his dark fantasy. As detectives continued to gather evidence, it became clear that Brian's actions had shattered any semblance of innocence the Cohee family had once known. The weight of his crimes bore down on everyone who had ever known him, as the lines between fascination and horror blurred into a reality that none could escape. This was no mere act of violence, it was the manifestation of a mind consumed by its own darkness, hidden in plain sight. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on Brian's parents, Terry and Brian Sir, as they sat in the police station, faces pale, hands clasped tightly together. They had come to terms with the heartbreaking reality that their son was not who they thought he was. But now, they faced an impossible choice: cooperate fully with the investigation, or shield their only child from the truth that loomed over him. They had raised Brian, loved him unconditionally, and yet, they now grappled with the knowledge that he had become a stranger, capable of unimaginable violence. For Terry, the memory of finding the evidence in his closet replayed in her mind with an agonizing clarity. Every moment of his childhood now felt tainted, each memory shadowed by the question of where they had gone wrong. Had there been signs they missed? She wondered if his fascination with crime had ever been harmless, or if it had always been a slow descent into darkness. As detectives laid out the facts of the case before them, the weight of their son's actions became undeniable. Brian Sir, usually a quiet, strong presence, sat silently, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. The stoic father now looked defeated, wrestling with emotions too complex to put into words. The turning point came during a difficult conversation with one of the lead investigators. He explained that the evidence against Brian was overwhelming, that the legal system would inevitably take its course. But he added that their cooperation would be crucial, not only to understand the extent of Brian's crimes, but perhaps to prevent further harm. If they helped, they might uncover more about Brian's intentions, might even stop him from acting on plans he had yet to carry out. In the hours that followed, Terry and Brian Stir came to a decision no parent should ever have to make. They agreed to assist law enforcement, providing any insights into Brian's behavior, past experiences, and interests that could help them make sense of the crimes. In doing so, they made a silent, painful choice to put the safety of others above their instinct to protect their son. Every interaction with the detectives was a test of their emotional resilience. They handed over family photos, journals, even school reports that hinted at Brian's interests in criminal justice. They recounted memories that, at the time, seemed innocuous but now felt like pieces of a tragic puzzle. Moments when Brian had been unusually distant, times when he expressed a curiosity about death in ways that unsettled them. Each recollection felt like an admission of failure, a piece of the son they thought they knew slipping further from their grasp. The grief was overwhelming, compounded by guilt and a gnawing sense of responsibility. They questioned everything, every choice they'd made, every discipline they'd enforced or overlooked. Had they not paid close enough attention? Was there something in their parenting that had contributed to this? These doubts haunted them, twisting the knife deeper into wounds that would never heal. In the days that followed, Terry and Brian Stir watched as the detectives built their case, poring over every piece of evidence, knowing that each item only cemented their son's fate. They struggled to reconcile the image of the little boy they had raised with the young man facing charges of murder. At night they would sit in silence, the walls of their home now heavy with a grief that could neither be spoken nor understood. This cooperation with law enforcement was their final act of love, an anguished attempt to protect others from the son they had lost to darkness. And as they provided the final pieces of information, they knew that their family's story would forever be marked by this choice, a choice that asked them to look beyond love and face the reality of who their son had become. The trial of Brian Cohii became a focal point for a community struggling to understand the unthinkable. Courtroom seats were filled with silent faces, each person grappling with the unsettling reality that the young man before them had once been a part of their town, their lives. As Brian entered the courtroom in shackles, his gaze remained fixed and expressionless, a chilling calm that only deepened the sense of horror. The prosecution laid out their case with a meticulous intensity, presenting each piece of evidence with a grim clarity that left little room for doubt. Crime scene photographs, forensic reports, and disturbing details from Brian's journals were shown to the court. The prosecutor's voice was steady as they described the brutal precision with which Brian had committed his crimes. They portrayed him as a cold, calculating individual who had planned and executed his actions with a chilling indifference. Each piece of evidence, from his internet searches to his detailed notes, painted a picture of a young man consumed by a fascination with death that had crossed the line into something monstrous. Witnesses took the stand one by one, each adding another layer to the narrative. Former classmates recalled his eerie knowledge of criminal cases, his disturbing comments about death, and his unnerving detachment. They spoke of a young man who had always been on the fringes, whose fascination with violence had once seemed harmless, but now took on a sinister significance. Teachers testified about Brian's academic brilliance and his peculiar focus on forensic science, noting that, in hindsight, there had been a level of obsession they hadn't recognized. Then, in a moment that held the courtroom in a tense silence, Brian's parents took the stand. Terry's voice trembled as she recounted the horrifying day she discovered the evidence in his closet. She spoke of the disbelief, the horror, and the overwhelming guilt that had followed. Her eyes were red with tears as she described her son not as a monster, but as the little boy she had raised, a boy she now barely recognized. Brian Sturr spoke only briefly, his words clipped and strained, a man clearly torn between love and incomprehension. Their testimonies laid bare the unimaginable burden they now carried, the pain of loving someone capable of such darkness. The defense, in turn, attempted to argue that Brian's actions were the result of mental illness, that his obsession with crime had spiraled out of his control. They painted a picture of a young man whose mind had been lost to delusions, arguing that he could not fully grasp the gravity of his actions. But each argument felt hollow against the stark reality of the evidence, the cold planning, the meticulous details Brian had recorded. The jury, and indeed the entire courtroom, could sense the weight of those facts, pressing down with an undeniable finality. As the trial drew to a close, the prosecution's final words left a lasting impression. This was not a crime of impulse. This was a calculated act by an individual who chose to embrace darkness, who took another person's life without remorse. The judge's gavel struck, reverberating through the silent room, a sound that echoed the finality of what had unfolded. Brian was found guilty, and as the sentence was read, a palpable wave of grief and relief washed over the courtroom. Some felt justice had been served, others were left with a hollow ache, knowing that justice could never truly heal the wounds Brian's actions had left behind. For his parents, the verdict brought no closure, only the cold comfort of an ending. They left the courthouse in silence, their faces etched with the sorrow of a family shattered, carrying with them the weight of a tragedy that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The verdict was read, guilty on all counts. Brian Cohey would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For the Cohey family, the finality brought no relief, only a deeper ache. Brian's parents sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of the sentence, a life condemned, a family shattered. Outside the courthouse, media coverage captured their hollow expressions, a quiet devastation written across their faces. They made no public statements, retreating instead into the shadows, now marked forever by their son's actions. The community, too, felt the aftershocks, struggling to reconcile how one of their own had hidden such darkness. Friends and neighbors exchanged glances, haunted by memories and unanswered questions. How could something like this happen so close to home? Was there any way to see it coming? As the story fades to black, viewers are left to ponder the boundaries of family loyalty, the pain of an unfathomable loss, and the complexity of human nature. It's a story that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes, the greatest mysteries lie hidden within the ones we love.